All right. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for coming. As you know, the Secretary General's report on children in armed conflict is out as a document today, and we're very fortunate to have with us the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, who will be here to talk to you about that report and to take your questions. Ms. Gamba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you again in this room. So I've also asked my staff to have copies of my first initial statement. If you want to take a copy, you are more than welcome. In 2023, violence against children in armed conflict reached extreme levels, with a shocking 21% increase in grave violations vis-à-vis prior years. Utilizing the monitoring and reporting mechanism and its approved guidelines, UN personnel verified 32,990 grave violations against children in 25 CAAC situations and one regional arrangement covering the Lake Chad Basin region. Of the 32,990 violations, 30,705 were committed in 2023, and the rest were committed earlier, but only verified in 2023. Violations affected a total of 22,557 children, of which 6,252 were girls. This provides another trend, as contrasted against other years, because the number of children who were victims of multiple grave violations increased, illustrated by the high percentage of girls being abducted for recruitment and sexual violence, including rape and sexual slavery. The highest numbers of grave violations during 2023 were first and foremost the killing and maiming of 11,649 children. Second, the recruitment and use of 8,655 children. And thirdly, the abduction of 4,356 children. Further, although a non-listable violation, the UN reported 5,205 verified incidents of the denial of humanitarian access to children, which is an unacceptably high figure, representing a 32% increase over previous years. Rape and sexual violence against children and attacks on schools and hospitals also increased or remained at exceptionally high levels, with 1,650 verified attacks on schools and hospitals and related personnel, and 1,470 verified conflict-related sexual violations against children, most of them girls. Sexual violence has historically been underreported, and yet this figure already is 25% increased over previous reporting cycles. I will discuss now the patterns and the trends we found in the figures of last year. Situations in the CAAC report where substantial increase in grave violations were verified include a rise of over 155% violations over prior years in the conflict in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, notably in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the occupied West Bank. While in Sudan, we witnessed a staggering 480% increase in grave violations against children in highly populated spaces such as in Khartoum and in the Darfur region. Furthermore, Myanmar's situation deteriorated, with a 123% rise in grave violations across the country, but with spikes in the Rakhine region. Unfortunately, grave violations also increased in the following situations: in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Lebanon, Nigeria, and Somalia. Another pattern that was perceived during 2023 was that roughly 50% of violations were committed by armed groups, including those designated as terrorists by the United Nations, whereas the rest were committed by state actors as they engaged in armed conflict with their opponents, and by unidentified perpetrators caused by landmines and IEDs. Armed groups were principally responsible for abduction, recruitment and use, and sexual violence against children, while the most prevalent violations attributed to state actors' armed forces were killing and maiming, including using explosive ordnance in highly populated areas, attacks on schools and hospitals, and related personnel, and denial of humanitarian access to children. Explosive remnants of war, UXOs, mines, and IEDs were responsible for the killing and maiming of children and for impeding humanitarian access to children. I want to also stress another disturbing trend: the continued use of schools and hospitals for military purposes by parties to conflict in many of the situations under the Children and Armed Conflict mandate. The military use of these facilities, critical to children's education and well-being, not only denies children the use of these critical services, but also often creates conditions for opposing parties to consider these facilities as military targets. I urge all parties to conflict to stop the military use of schools and to ensure that hospitals retain their protected status. The last item I wish to highlight is the plight of children detained or deprived of liberty for their association or alleged association to parties to conflict. Detention should be used only as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. Children should never be detained or prosecuted solely for their or their families' actual or alleged association with armed groups. I urge member states to treat children actually or allegedly associated with armed forces or groups, including those designated as terrorists by the United Nations, primarily as victims, to prioritize their best interest and to give child protection actors access to them. Ultimately, as I have said before, a child is a child is a child, even when they are perpetrators of violence. For this reason, any killing, maiming, or detention of children, regardless of the circumstances, will be recorded as such in the CAAC reports. Now I will discuss the listing decisions of the Secretary General for this year. The decision of this year of the Secretary General for new listings of state actors and non-state armed groups reflects these patterns that I've just explained. As follows: the ferocious armed struggle by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, who had been allies in the past, has led to the listing of both these parties. The Sudanese armed forces have been listed for the grave violations of killing and maiming and for attacks on schools and hospitals. The Rapid Support Forces armed group has been listed for killing and maiming, recruitment and use, rape and other forms of sexual abuse, and attacks on schools and hospitals. The brutal acts of terror perpetrated on the 7th of October of 2023 on Israeli communities involving the deliberate killing, maiming, torture, and abduction of civilians, including children and other protected persons, as planned and conducted by the armed group Hamas Isn al-Din al-Qassam brigades and affiliated factions, and by the armed group Palestinian Islamic Jihad al-Quds brigades, has led to the listing for the violations of killing and maiming and abduction of children. The magnitude of the reaction by Israeli armed and security operations against Hamas Isn al-Din al-Qassam brigades, the tightening of repressive operations in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the use of explosive weapons of war with high impact in densely populated areas in the Gaza Strip, leading to death of civilians, including children, and the destruction of civilian objects, has led to the listing of the Israeli armed and security forces for the violations of killing and maiming of children and attacks on schools and hospitals in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. All further listings this year relate to non-state armed groups and UN-designated terrorist groups, including the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara operating in Burkina Faso, the Alliance des Forces de Résistance Congolaises in the DRC, the Alliance des Patriotes pour un Congo Libre et Souverain in the DRC, the Mouvement du 23 Mars in the DRC, and the Jama Nusrat ul-Islam wa al-Muslimin, including Ansar Eddin in Mali. It is important to consider the Secretary General's report on this file in the correct normative context. The report is not a legal analysis, and the customary use of terms applied in the report do not constitute legal findings. For this reason, the annexes to the report are not a legal determination, but are developed as a tool of engagement to urge parties to conflict to better protect children and to provide relief and remedy to end and prevent the use and abuse of children for, in, and by armed conflict. The report includes and assesses information in respect of the 6 grave CAAC violations against conflict-affected children through the monitoring and reporting mechanism on children and armed conflict. The mechanism was set up by the United Nations to implement Security Council Resolution 1612 and subsequent resolutions. The purpose of the mechanism is to collect and provide for the systematic gathering of information on grave violations committed against children in conflict situations. The information is then used as a basis to foster compliance of parties to conflict with international child protection norms and standards, and leads to well-informed, concerted, and effective advocacy and responses to protect and care for children through, most often, jointly agreed action plans between the United Nations and listed parties to end and prevent violation against children. Now I will try to share with you some of the good news of the report. No delisting was decided upon by the Secretary General this year. However, positive developments and progress in the provision of better protection of children in armed conflict was identified and mentioned in the report, both in the specific CAAC situations and in Section 5 of the report. Progress was particularly remarked in Iraq, Mozambique, the Philippines, South Sudan, Ukraine, and Yemen, all of which have recorded decreases in the number of grave violations. The UN further made progress in commencing engagement with parties to conflict to protect children in situations in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, the Philippines, Somalia, South Sudan, the Syrian Arab Republic, Ukraine, and Yemen, some of which led to the adoption of measures aimed at providing better protection for children affected by armed conflict. Lastly, more than 10,600 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups received protection or reintegration support during 2023. Invariably, the progress on the protection of children from the ravages of war, as noted above, was greatly assisted by the decision by parties to conflict to engage constructively with the United Nations on the ending and preventing grave violations. The decision, for example, of the opposition Syrian National Army, including Harar al-Sham and Army of Islam, to sign a joint action plan with me to stop the recruitment and use of children in its armed conflict is a welcome act that is expected to release hundreds of children from military ranks. In truth, most, if not all, of the positive actions highlighted by the Secretary General this year in Section 5 as pertaining to parties listed have to do with engagement progress linked to an actual or potential action plan. For this reason, I urge all listed parties to immediately consider the development and signature of action plans with the United Nations to better protect children and end and prevent the use and abuse of children in, for, and by armed conflict situations. In conclusion, the changing nature, complexity, expansion, and intensification of armed conflict, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, deliberate or indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including infrastructure, and the advent of new armed groups alongside acute humanitarian emergencies and blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and severe violations of international human rights law have led to alarming increases in grave violations. Additionally, new situations of concern have arisen in Haiti and Niger, where the number of grave violations against children is alarming. Lastly, cross-border conflicts and intercommunal violence have persistently impacted children, especially those in the Central Sahel and Lake Chad Basin regions. The monitoring and verification of grave violations remained extremely challenging, including owing to access constraints, high insecurity and threats, and direct attacks on UN personnel, monitors, and humanitarian actors, leading to the underreporting of grave violations. The monitoring and reporting mechanism on CAAC, while robust, can be improved. But this cannot occur if the resources dedicated to the monitoring and reporting of grave violations against children are continuously cut from the budgets of agencies and bodies due to economic constraints of member states and the reprioritizing of UN funds to serve other purposes other than those of ending and preventing violations against children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gamba. Thanks very much for the briefing. I'll now turn the floor over for questions. First question, Sharife.
Shall we do three at a time?
What?
Three at a time?
If we'll try to gather them up so that she can do them a few at a time. So Sharife, and then after that, Deji.
Ms. Gamba, thank you very much. I'm Sharifa Chitin from Anadolu Agency. If you will allow me, I would like to ask you why you have not been more outspoken about the horrific situation of children in Gaza after the 7th of October. Because from what I see, you have one statement on the 16th of April, and you warn against the risk of starvation and imminent famine for children in Gaza and Sudan. But for example, on the 3rd of April, I followed the Security Council consultations where intentionally depriving life-saving humanitarian assistance to children living in conflict zones was discussed. You did not mention a word of Gaza. So I would like to understand what explains your relative silence, considering that more than 15,000 children have been killed in Gaza since October. Thank you.
Okay, and Deji?
Hi, Ms. Gamba. Shudoji with China Central Television. So a couple of questions. First, what do you feel that Israel said that given the fact of the report that IDF is the most moral army in the world, what is your response? And you said it's not a legal finding. But don't you worry that if it's not legal finding, it's not legal binding, nobody would care about this report? And what is your projection for this year? Because we know some of those most important and violent conflicts are still going. Thank you.
Do you want to handle those now or one more?
Sure,
Okay.
we can do that.
Okay.
I think I have heard a lot about this business of mine not being outspoken or not on the issue of Gaza. Frankly, I think those remarks are a cause of concern to me because clearly I've spoken publicly more than 7 times about it with issuing public statements. That doesn't seem to register anyway. And then there was much ado about a presentation that the Security Council Presidency of Malta called to discuss denial of humanitarian access as a general theme, something that had been in the agenda of the Security Council for some time, with a concept note specifically designed to talk about the denial of humanitarian access as a general theme globally. I was required, as per the concept note, to only relate to the general discussion of DHA, whereas the other speakers following me were required to pick up cases. It is therefore both, I would say, perhaps the best word to say is unkind of one member of the Security Council who had access to the concept note months before to ascribe an intention behind my generic language as required by the President of the Security Council for that generic briefing. So I think that much has been said about nothing, and I'm not saying that I resent it, but it generates a real context of putting doubts about my own objectivity and impartiality in my file, which I really do not accept. I think on the second question about the issue of what the ambassador of Israel tweeted on on Friday last week, this was a leak. It was a leak of a discussion he had with the chef de cabinet when he was given the courtesy of being informed, given a heads up that the Israeli armed and security forces would be listed in the annual report. At no point, as you will see when you read the report, is the mention of the word IDF, so therefore it is incorrect. It's much broader than IDF. It's armed and security forces of Israel. So I think it was a premature leak, not on the basis of a document. The document had not been published, and as far as I know, the document had not been shared. It was only a conversation. As relates to the legal, it has always been a purview of this mandate. It was generated by the General Assembly on a specific decision over 27 years ago. And for the last 25 years, we also obey the mandates, definitions, and requests of the Security Council. And over the 13 Security Council resolutions we have to implement on a year basis, at no point in time has that decision been to gather information for other purposes than raising attention on the perpetrators of patterns and trends on the 6 grave violations with the ultimate object of changing their behavior, because it is an action-oriented report that leads to my immediate engagement with listed parties to convince them to sign action plans to end and prevent those violations. If they so decide, they're all sovereign states or armed groups with their own ideas, they can decide to engage. If they decide to engage, we are under an obligation to provide technical assistance to that listed party in order for them to speedily stop the violation, release children if they are in their possession, and engage in prevention measures for the future. With this object, this purpose of this annual report, we have managed to delist many state actors as well as non-state armed groups over the years, and I would posit that in many cases there has not been a repetition of the types of violations we have seen in the past. I'm talking of places like Sierra Leone, like Sri Lanka, like Nepal. Even in India, we have already put in place the measures, Thailand. These have been in the report for some years, and then out of the report, once the measures mutually agreed have been put in place. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll do one cluster here before we go to the screens. Gabriel, then Edie.
Thank you, Ms. Gamba. My name is Gabriel Elizondo from Al Jazeera English. Thank you for your briefing. Regarding your report and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, paragraph 97, you say, in your report, it says, owing to severe access challenges, in particular in the Gaza Strip, the information presented here in this report does not represent the full scale of violations against children. Can you please explain that? Because you could read into that perhaps that this is an undercount of children because of the lack of access. Can you please spell that out a little bit for us in more detail? And my second question, if you may, ma'am, with all due respect to you and your office and the work that you do, I want to follow up on my colleague Sharife's question. How can your office enhance its responsiveness to grave violations against children in real time, rather than just gathering data in the after the fact?
Excellent.
Thank you, ma'am.
That's much better, yeah.
And then Edie before. Edie, and then she'll take both your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gamba, and belatedly on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you very much for doing this briefing. Can you tell us what situations worry you most right now? Where are you most concerned for the plight of children caught in conflict? Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll deal with those two. I want to thank your question. I think I can expand on this in these terms a lot more. First, I would ask you to read the whole report because it is standard language that we use year upon year, that the figures in this report represent always the tip of the iceberg. We do not believe that these are the sole figures. We do not believe that this is the full picture of what is happening to children. But because of the very strict guidelines on monitoring and reporting as determined by the Security Council in Resolution 1612 and posterior, for us, verification is a verification of two types. Monitors, first of all, must be officials of the United Nations. It cannot be delegated to others or to governments, by the way. And no government that sends information to us would be considered. It also, we do not take into account NGO information or press information. It has to be United Nations on the ground that provides information to me. At the same time, that information must be verified. The verification, and I think a very good case, how difficult it is to explain this, is if you read afterwards in your own good time, paragraph 109. It is very confusing. You don't know exactly how many children. Why? Because there's three different amounts of figures that normally we are looking at. Monitors sometimes can verify the existence of a violation, i.e. a child has been killed, for example, or a child has been abducted. That's one type of verification. So when we say verified so many violations, don't stop on the first line. You have to continue reading, because then it will say, of those verified violations, we were also able to verify attribution. And it's far less numbers that have got verified attribution. So there are different numbers. We verified that the violation actually occurred and it's not the figment of the imagination of somebody. 2, who committed that violation, which also must undertake verification. And when you look, it's not just the listed parties in the annexes that are normally few. If you read the situations, you will find a multitude of other actors where the monitors were able to verify attribution, sometimes one to one actor. And it could be, anybody. It could be a citizen, it could be an individual, it could be an authority, a local authority. If they have verified that attribution, they will mention it in the situation. So we verify that the violation occurred, and 2, who committed it. That information is the one set that has the greater weight when the Secretary General takes decisions. However, in situations that are what we call hot conflict, i.e. where bombs are falling, where there are restrictions of movement, where there is true access restrictions for monitors to do their job and find the people. Many people flee. You have to try to find the people where they fled. Happened to us in Rakhine, where 700,000 people fled to Bangladesh. We had to go to Bangladesh to try to pick up the stories for verification of what had happened. So it's very difficult. Therefore, we have no access. So we're just assuming. We don't even have the amount of reports we need to start verification, although we know it's possibly in the tens of thousands of child violations there. So when we said in this 97 that owing to severe access restrictions, these, and particularly in the Gaza Strip, less so in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, less so there, we were able to monitor more. You will see in 109 that there's more figures for those two parts than for Gaza. Does it mean that those, we also mentioned reports. When a situation is so big that really our monitors are beginning to pick up a lot of reports that they have not yet been able to verify as having been done, then we put the figures of reported under verification or verified under verification of attribution, unattributed or attributed. So in all cases, these are the smallest numbers you will find, but by the same time, they are strong. And I think this is what makes for the sensitivity of this annual report. As relates to the question, you asked about how can we increase responsiveness. I think what we would need, I assume, is another resolution of the Security Council that can indicate what would be the modality of reporting. As it stands now, we are condemned to report only verified violations the year that was. So our reports always come out in June. We cannot express anything that happened from 1st of January of the year where we are reporting until next year. So we're always late in coming. As such, until our monitors are able to inform us what they have been verified or not, we cannot go public with figures that have not been verified, and that only happens always post facto. So that puts us in a very difficult situation. Luckily, in Resolution 2427 of 2018, I was given a mandate to engage in prevention of violations in situations of armed conflict, which means non-listed parties. I can also engage with them and I can call their attention. I have been trying to make use of that resolution ever since Libya and then even in Ethiopia before these situations were even considered as situations of concern in the annual report by the Secretary General. But the tone I always apply, I did it in, for example, Ukraine, before there was a decision to include the situation of concern, and even before the listing decision, where if I note that there is a spike, there is an armed conflict where I have reason to believe children are under threat, I will go public to remind all parties to conflict of their obligations under the 6 grave violations. In a way, I'm saying we're watching. And I can remind them so many times that we're watching. This is what I can do. I would love to have a better responsive mechanism at my disposal, but without a specific resolution of the Security Council allowing me to do that, I would be, in fact, undermining the monitor and reporting mechanisms methodology. Yes, most concerned for the plight of children, it's very difficult because the world has got limited attention spans. The media and the international community, for different reasons, has spikes of attention on any one situation. So it's very hard to push that attention to plights of children in other places. It's like we can't handle the globality of it. So I'll be honest, of course I am very concerned about the plight of children in situations we already know are hot conflicts and ongoing wars, like in Ukraine, like in Gaza, West Bank, Israel, East Jerusalem. Of course I'm worried about all of those. But the ones that I'm really worried about for the, let's say, the rest of this year and beginning of next year are, first and foremost, Sudan, particularly Darfur and Chad, because it is expanding very quickly. Second, I'm very concerned about DRC, particularly when the United Nations leaves DRC at the end of December. What will happen next for children when I lose my eyes, my hands on the ground? I don't know. The monitoring will continue, but it won't be, the engagement that we were able to do won't happen. And I believe there's massive sexual violence ongoing in the DRC. And as we speak, that's going to spike. I'm very concerned of Haiti. Haiti this year was not listed. The parties in Haiti were not listed. They've been identified. There's a couple of them that is really bad, the figures against that couple of armed groups. But the problem is they were only created situations of concern in June of last year. So we've only been able to monitor with specific monitoring process, 12 months finishing now in June. So we would be in a position to be able to give the figures to the Secretary General between last year and this year, but not just over 6 months. But I am very concerned because it seems to be endemic and particularly systemic, the rape of girls and the abduction and recruitment of children. UNICEF has spoken about it. We commend the work of UNICEF in that sense. So very worried about Haiti. And then finally, of course, I'm very worried about Myanmar and the spillover of conflict into Bangladesh. Very worried about that. I think these are the 3 biggest ones for the future and the horizon. I'm worried about Somalia and Afghanistan. Anyway, that's it.
Could I just ask one quick follow-up on Sudan? Have you had any access at all to what's going on in Darfur from Chad and the monitor?
Okay, what I do in situations such as this, where we have lost our eyes on the ground because UNITAMS is gone, we do have a child protection monitor still in Abyei trying to give us information. But I have sent letters to fellow agencies in the UN that still have, particularly humanitarians, still have a presence. And I've asked them to please beef up their monitoring and reporting capacities so that they can take over from the monitors that I have lost. At the same time, I have repeatedly sent letters to both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudan Armed Forces demanding that they cease and desist and engage with me immediately on prevention and now on protection measures. I have not received a reply to any of my letters.
Okay, next we'll go first to Mike in the back and then to Abdulhamid. Mike?
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you, Ms. Gamba, for doing this. It's appreciated. By the way, I'm Mike Wagenheim from I-24 News in Israel. I had a couple questions for you. First off, in paragraph 104 of your report, it's a paragraph about Hamas's attacks on schools and hospitals in Israel. There's a line at the end that says, quote unquote, there are numerous other reports of the use of human shields by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. I wanted to speak to that line. The European Union, which can't agree on anything, agreed on November 13th that Hamas was using human shields. The Secretary General himself, ironically enough, said on November 6th that Hamas was using human shields. A senior member of Hamas's Politburo during this war said that the tunnels, the vast tunnel network, was only for Hamas leadership and military assets, and essentially Hamas is not responsible for the protection of its civilians. The UN has admitted, often belatedly, that its facilities were being used for military assets and personnel for Hamas. The whole context of the casualty toll for children in Gaza during this war, even if one feels that Israel needs to be doing better, it seems it cannot be looked at outside of the context of Hamas using its citizens as cannon fodder, as human shields. But in your report, it's simply a throwaway line. There are just numerous other reports. How is that justified? So that's my first question. Second question, there are a few pieces of curious accounting in here that I wanted to try to clarify. I spoke with a UN official a few days ago, but it's even more eye-popping in this year's report. The report notes almost 1,900 instances of Israeli armed and security forces maiming Palestinian children. But 63% of those instances are from tear gas inhalation, which is a standard only applied to Israel. Only Israel is charged with tear gas inhalation, though it's a common tactic around the world. And by your office's own standards, only an action that causes serious, permanent, or disabling injury to a child counts as maiming. There are no reports of any widespread death, chemical burns, blindness of Palestinian children as a result of tear gas inhalation. Denial of medical care. Of the applications for medical care for Gazan and West Bank children, only 15% were denied, according to your own numbers, which is less than most medical plans here in America. And there's no context as to why even those 15% were denied, whether it's a lack of a doctor's appointment, paperwork, whether those appointments were later rescheduled. It just says that there were 3,000 some cases of denial. Those are pretty harsh accusations when it comes to humanitarian violations against children. Yet, it seems to be an anomaly when it comes to Israel and the accounting applied to it. Can you explain that as well?
Okay, and Abdulhamid, and then we'll go to the answers.
Thank you, Ms. Gamba. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I have a few questions as well. First, Ms. Catherine Russell, the executive director of UNICEF, took the risk and visited Gaza, as many other senior UN officials. UNICEF and your office are primarily in charge of issues related to children, but you did not take that step and visit Gaza to see for your own eyes what was going on. That is, I need that to explain that. And the second, there are a few organized settler movement. Organized. I'm not talking about a settler who stands by the street and shoot at Palestinians or put an olive field on fire. No, I'm talking about organized settlers, especially the young men of the hills and the revenge group. Why they were not mentioned. Third, have you personally, this is a personal question, have you seen Khalid Nabhan when he put his granddaughter, Reem, put it up, this is the picture, I'm sure you saw it. And he said this, the soul of my soul, the Reem, the baby who was killed, which shook the whole world. did it shake you, that picture, and took tears, put tears in your eyes? And finally, we've been arguing with you for the last 5 years why you did not include Israel in the list of shame. And you brought us all kinds of excuses. Do you believe that you were wrong and Israel should have been included the way Layla Zarrouki included Israel, but it was removed in the last minute? Your predecessor, Layla Zarrouki. Thank you.
Well, both of these questions are really welcome because it allows us to delve a little bit more again on what we do and what we don't do. Let me start with I-24 News about the issue of human shields. I think that the reference of human shields on 104, first of all, if we put everything in the annual report on every situation, it would have at least 1,000 pages. So we have to choose very carefully what makes it to the report or not. If the figures must go there, as much context as possible, but we have always been deterred from putting into context each one of these paragraphs because of word count. I have to say it. Perhaps by saying it here, I will be heard. Many times every year, I've asked for waivers on word count for this annual report because the sensitivity, 26 situations, cannot be handled one-page situation. It really is inappropriate, I believe. I will continue with this fight, but we're all under constraints. It is mostly a financial issue and an issue of a standard across the UN system. I'm not saying that if I had more room, you would have more answers, but the identification of human shields, as indicated in 104, is exactly that. The minute this language enters the annual report, for us, it means that it has to be verified. So these reports, in next year's report, might be able to be verified as late verification processes. You have to understand the timings of this report. We are all sitting here with information that is blasting to us on a daily basis. We are condemned to just looking at January to December. The last quarter of last year was a huge, huge increase by all parties to conflict, as we call them, on violations against children, because it was reflective of the situation at the time. So I think when we talk about it's a recognition by the United Nations that children have been used as human shields, and that this recognition will lead for verification purposes and monitoring purposes to late verifications. I think we possibly might be able to see more information on this specific and attribution on who specifically was using children as human shields in the next annual report. I know it's not the answer you want, but this is what I can tell you. As relates to tear gas inhalation, this is a very interesting issue. Each country task force or each working group of the monitoring, reporting, implementing bodies, who are the ones that implement the MRM in the 26 situations, it always is a mix of two co-chairs. The one co-chair is always the highest UN representative in the country. Most normally, if there is a military operation or a special mission there, would be the SRSG in charge of that. Through the number two, it could be the humanitarian coordinator in that situation, or the resident coordinator if there is no SRSG, plus the UNICEF representative. They are co-chairs of what? Of a working group of UN agencies that are all present in that space, So you cannot choose which agencies are there or are not there. And now they immediately have to come together and start monitoring and reporting violations. Clearly, all situations are not unique. The monitoring and reporting methodology is unique. It is a standard. It is old. It is from 2005, but it has to be kept very strictly, and it is very strictly done. But the way it is interpreted in the field depends on each violation, in each situation, because they are unique. The expression of violence against children is expressed differently in different situations. I agree with you entirely. It's the only situation that has been informing us of tear gas inhalation under the rubric of maiming. Is this correct or not correct? All I can tell you is it's not for me to decide what is correct or not. It is the MRF guidelines that allow that type of broad interpretation. But,
Just to clarify,
but,
it does.
but, let
I'll
me
let you
finish.
continue, maybe
Let me
afterward.
finish.
Continue, please.
Let me assure you that ever since we started noting that the figures on killing and maiming included tear gas inhalation, the Secretary General himself took the decision that whenever he has been discussing year upon year the potential listing of parties such as Israel, he has always instructed that that figure be not considered. So tear gas inhalation is not considered as part of maiming in his decision-making process. And this year it was the same case. Do we have to live with this forever? I think the answer lies in the production of technical guideline notes. As you know, I have been trying to reinforce the capacity of monitors to be able to do their job. And to do that, I've done a technical guidance note on monitors on the abduction, on the grave violation of abduction. What is an abduction, what is not? That has been already launched 2 years ago to great help of monitors. This year, and that goes to your last question, I have ordered a denial of humanitarian access technical guidelines that will indicate clearly to monitors when there is a real denial of humanitarian access as a violation of CAAC. So we hear you. There is a need to better understand this issue. For us, denial of humanitarian access is a non-listable violation. So the Secretary General cannot take decisions based on any figures on denial of humanitarian access. But I agree with you. Normally, an annual report, because of the word count and the space it occupies, focuses on the negatives. But I have been engaging with Israel since December 2022, and I particularly commenced engagement on how we could speed up permits so that they could not be delayed ultimately. This worked. For the first quarter of last year, we saw an 88.5 approval of all requests from children to leave Gaza for medical treatment. So it was very good. We were working on those terms. I have been engaging constantly to try to put in place measures, identify where the loopholes are to lower this issue. And we got quite well into the third quarter with this before the October massacre and then the response in Gaza.
Just a quick clarification. You're saying that of those 1,187 cases of tear gas inhalation, all of them cause serious, permanent, or disabling injury? That's your office's claim? Because that's the only reason those should be listed, right?
No, they're getting confused.
Okay.
I just said the Secretary General does not determine listings on the basis of tear gas inhalation. His decisions is not taken on that basis.
But they're listed here as maiming children. And under your definition of maiming children, it has to cause serious, permanent, or disabling injury. If it's not, why is it on there at all? Whether the Secretary General considers it or not, why is it on there?
It is disaggregated so you can see. You can see that figure because we gave the instruction that it be disaggregated. This is information that comes from the field. That information is disaggregated so people know what was shrapnel, what was live ammunition, what was for example, a rubber-coated bullet that was fatal, and what was tear gas inhalation. There are different disaggregations that are put here for transparency's sake. What I'm telling you is the Secretary General does not take decisions based on tear gas inhalation. But I have to agree to put in the text what I received from the field.
Thank you, Ms. Gamba.
Okay. Next on the screen, we have. Oh, sorry.
I am sorry. Yes, I think I've responded a little bit to that. You have to understand, Catherine Russell is the head of a humanitarian agency. I would have been very surprised if she did not go to Gaza immediately. I would be very surprised if OCHA did not go to there immediately. I would be very surprised if UNHCR did not go there immediately, or the Secretary General. They did what they had to do. Because the way the United Nations works, when there is a huge humanitarian crisis, as this was, first move the humanitarians. First is the provision of assistance. And so, absolutely, we would have expected, and those agencies had priority. If every single person in the United Nations Secretariat, mostly at political level, ends up trying to get into Gaza, not only we disrupt everything, but put the attention on us instead of the situation. So I have nothing to say. It was not my decision not to go to Gaza. I go when I'm asked to go. I don't have that type of latitude of other SRSGs. If a country task force, working group CAAC, or the Secretary himself asks me to do something or to go to the field, I go. I have never gone to the field at my own volition. It's always at the request of the field. The field did not request my visit to Gaza. And so I obey. I'm an international civil servant. I think the issue of pictures of children, you will be amazed the amount of pictures of children I see across all 6 grave violations and across 26 situations. If I was moved for each one of those pictures, I resign my job today. I am moved, I keep it to myself because someone has to do the job, and you cannot do the job if you're in a heap of tears on the floor. So I'm sorry, I'm not that type of a personality. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry?
My question about the settlers.
Oh, the question, well, if you look at the report, you will see that for the last 3 years, they've been identified as parties to conflict. They are there. They are in the text. They have not yet been listed, but they are parties to conflict as non-state actors. I have not heard of these subdivisions that you're talking about. Perhaps in the next year's annual report, we will get information, but we have not yet received it.
Okay. The next question will go to Alejandro online from NTN, and then to Maggie Bashir.
Thanks a lot, Farhan. Hola, representante especial Gamba, soy Alejandro Rincón de NTN 24.
Bien.
La pregunta es sobre la situación en Colombia. Representante especial Gamba, en el reporte inmediatamente anterior, ustedes marcaron 290 violaciones graves y en el nuevo reporte tienen 432, es decir, un aumento de 67% solo en un año. ¿Hay algún otro lugar del mundo en donde se esté dando este incremento tan grave ahora mismo? Y la otra consulta es sobre la inclusión de violaciones graves contra niños venezolanos en Colombia. ¿Por qué decidieron reportar a partir de ahora la situación de los niños venezolanos? ¿Hay algo allí que estén siguiendo?
Okay.
Okay. Well, first, because we don't have simultaneous translation, for the benefit of the reporters in the room and watching, could you please also quickly repeat in English?
I can say what he said in English. Don't worry, I'll say what you say. He's basically asking whether, with the increasing violations in Colombia, over 67% over 1 year on grave violations, whether there's any other place in the world where this type of increments have occurred. Yes, and worse, I told you. In Sudan, 480% more. In Israel OPT, 155% more, most of them in the last quarter of the year. You have in almost all the other situations over 100% increment in all the ones that I've mentioned as having a worsening situation. In the statement that I've read and that we're happy to send you one. There's copies here in front. You will see the percentages. Yes, Colombia is not the only one. It is something for us to worry about, indeed. As relates to your other question, whether Venezuelan children that are mentioned as having suffered grave violations, is this for a specific reason? Yes, you have to understand the reason. We monitor children, regardless from what nationality they are. If a violation occurred in the territory of a country, we mention it, if that country is a situation of concern. Unfortunately, we are doomed to the situations of concern or the situations in the agenda of the Security Council or those designated by the Secretary General as situations of concern. I don't choose which situations worry me that I would put in the annual report. I have no power to choose. But in the case of Colombia, Colombia is a situation in the annual report, and therefore we try to monitor the status of all the children in that plan. As you well know, for the last 7 years, if not more, there have been millions of Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela and have migrated either to Colombia or through Colombia to Ecuador, and through Ecuador either up towards the Central American region like Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Mexico, or down towards Peru, Chile, Argentina, eventually Brazil. So as they are in movement, most of the minors that we are seeing, and we are worried about that, are unaccompanied minors below 18 years old. And we're noticing a pattern where these children that are of a different nationality, that are transiting through a country, are very vulnerable, more if they're girls. But boys or girls unaccompanied minors, within these territories, there's extensive criminal groups and bands, not just armed groups. And there is a spike in Colombia in the use and abuse of children by armed groups and bands for the purpose either of sexual violence or trafficking of children beyond the country, or forcible recruitment into bands and gangster bands, forcing them to commit crimes. And Venezuelan children are particularly vulnerable because they are not even in their own country. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Margaret Bashir, and then I think we'll wrap up with one final thing from Sharife and then close off.
Thank you.
Margaret.
Hi, Ms. Gamba. It's Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. Just to circle back to what you were saying about Sudan, you said you sent several letters to the RSF and the SAF. I'm just wondering if you actually got any response. And we're receiving some reports from El Fasher that the RSF is not allowing boys over the age of 16 to leave the city. I'm wondering, and they're also killing some of them. I'm wondering if your monitors are receiving similar reports presently. As you know, the city's in a very bad way. Thank you.
And then Sharife, and then we'll turn the floor back to Ms. Gamba.
I just want to clarify regarding my initial question that before coming down here, I went through your official website, the United Nations website on children and armed conflict, and looked through each of your statements. You've mentioned that you've spoken about Gaza more than 7 times, but we don't see it here. So for journalists, it's important that it's here because this is where we will look, or we will look at the, your social media posts or what we see on TV or your interviews. So if we see it, you can rest assured that we will cover it, we will register it. Just wanted to note on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me answer you first. I thank you so much for that clarification, because sometimes it's good for me to know that you are verifying. Sometimes I get a little bit upset when I think it's things taken from the air. But let me take the opportunity to say we're only 12 people in my office. We monitor 26 situations and over 100 parties to conflict. We do prevention, we do engagement, we do field visits. Every 3 months we put together a global horizontal note. We are the secretariat of the Working Group of the Security Council. And frankly, we have one communications officer that sometimes have to multitask because all hands on deck when we have a surge. We've never received any financial assistance to put up a web, to have a webmaster. We've never received extra budgetary funds for any of the needs that we have asked. But I love it that you mention it, because what I would say is we have been trying to tweet at least once a week. That has been like our minimum. and we've really gone out of the way to do it. But it might be that contrasted to others, it looks little. But for us, it's huge. So perhaps you could talk to our communication officer, and perhaps there can be ways in which we can be helped a little bit more to reflect more our concerns. The web, sometimes I just give up on it. When I click on it, sometimes it's not my people. I love my people, my staff. They're overwhelmed. So thank you for that opportunity. Margaret, I think I have to say, with the rapid support forces in Sudan, I am very frustrated. I think at this point in time, we have verified what you say, the recruitment and use of boys under 18, including a large number for which they're listed on recruitment and use. I think the total recruitment and use for this year, it's about 87 that is specifically attributed to them. Some it's unidentified yet. We have not been able to verify the violation, but not exactly who is doing it. This is very much compounded with our lack of eyes on the whole Darfur region and what is happening there. You have to understand that Sudan for years has been in the annual report, but usually it was not as a whole country. In some of our situations, it's not a whole country. In Mozambique, it's just Cabo Delgado, right? Well, in Sudan, it always was Darfur, Blue Nile, and South Kordofan. Now it's different. Now it's the whole country. So you might have recruitment and use. There are many, many armed groups. There are some that are including among terrorist lists as UN designated, operating inside the Sudanese territory. But as ascribed and attributed to the rapid support forces for this year, of the year that was alone, is 87. So we have been able to verify 57 sexual violence against this one group. We have been able to identify at least 37 attacks on schools and hospitals. We have been able to verify 10 abductions perpetrated by this group and 136 killing and maiming attributed to this specific group. By far, the rapid support forces are the ones that seem to be not taking into account the special protections of children. Interestingly enough, when you talk about the Sudanese armed forces, they had been extensively trained by the UN on the ground, and even by my office and the CTFMR on the ground, and by UNICEF for years on stopping recruitment of children, and that had gone to a zero stand. We also had been able to give them a lot of capacity about the 6 grave violations, and it shows in the figures ascribed to them. However, the killing and maiming and the attacks on schools and hospitals caused by the use of explosive ordnance with high impact in highly populated spaces led to their listing. And I am hoping against hope that they will answer my letters. I believe they will. Perhaps now they will. Perhaps now they will. I will wait and let you know if it happens.
Thank you. And again, I'd like to thank Virginia Gamba, the Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, for her very extensive briefing. Thanks so much for coming down and talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you
have a good morning, and we'll be back in 45 minutes for the briefing.
Yeah, and you can pick up my statement from there. Thank you.